Okay, in this video, we are now going to be dealing with using Linux. Um, Now, I am assuming, and I can minimize this, I am assuming that at this point you have watched the beginning with Windows video and you have the core skills for using a computer. You understand how to use the mouse at this point. You understand what keyboard shortcuts are and things like that. That way I don't have to spend as much time explaining the clicking of the mouse and things like that. So when I say click this, you understand that, for example, from the other video, that I'm saying that that's a left click, and then when I say right click, that's not a double right click, that there's no such thing, it's a single right click, and so forth. So we're building on some of the skills that you've already learned from the beginning with Windows video now in Linux. So first off, let me explain that what you're seeing right now is not the default. Should you choose to either purchase a computer that has Ubuntu Linux preloaded, or to switch to it on your own, um, either doing a dual boot situation on your computer where you have a Windows operating system and this, or you just I don't really like Windows and I'm going to use just this. No matter what situation that is, this is not going to be the way that it looks when you first start it up. There's going to be some similarities, but I've added programs and I've changed some system settings. So let me get into that first to explain to you the way that this is going to look. First off, right down here at the bottom right of the screen, this is something that this is software that I've added in. This won't be preloaded. You won't have a preloaded weather app in your fresh install of Ubuntu. So I can actually get rid of that. When you first install Ubuntu, the other major difference too is that you won't have uh, the launcher. Where is it? There it is. Hidden. So I'm going to unhide that. So it will look more or less like this. Some of these icons, which are called, I believe, launchers in um, Ubuntu, that you see here are ones that I've added. Um, so again, this isn't going to look exact. You won't have these exact programs here and so forth, but I can show you, and this is one of the things I will show you, how you can add your own, how you can remove them, and so on, so that you can customize that how you want. The other thing too is this is a Clipboard Manager, and that won't come preloaded either. That's software that you add in, and so I'll go ahead and get rid of that. So it will look at this point very similar to this. This is Ubuntu 15.04. This is the most recent version of Ubuntu. This was just released on the 23rd, I believe, of April, and you can see here it's the 27th. So this is for all intents and purposes brand new. This desktop background that you see, this wallpaper here, that is the default wallpaper. You can change that, and I will be showing you how. Um, so let's before I go any further, explain some core terminology and explain what Linux is and so on. Many of the people that I know will be watching these videos have not even heard of Linux. They've never seen Linux. They don't know what it is. They've used nothing but Windows on their computer. Maybe they've used nothing but Mac. Again, most of the people that I know will be watching this have only used Windows. They haven't even used a Mac. I myself haven't used Mac in 15 years. I used my grandmother's neighbor. Um, my grandmother on my mom's side's neighbor had one of the original iMacs, and that was late 90s, early 2000s. So that tells you how long ago it's been since I've used a Mac. And so a lot of this is going to look unfamiliar, and there's going to be some skills that you're going to need to know with Linux that you haven't had to use before in Windows. But we're going to cover all of that, and by the time you're done with this video and you practice on your own, should you again, you'd have to install. You'd obviously have to install Linux, but practice on your own. Should you choose to install Linux, you will not have any problem if you watch this video. It's going to tell you everything that you need to know to be able to start with Linux and use it efficiently and not have it be a hassle for you. So the first thing that I want to explain is, what is Linux? Linux is spoken about, including by people that have used Linux for years, as though it's an operating system. Linux is not an operating system. Linux is a kernel, and you can see in my word processor program how that is spelled. It's not spelled kernel as in Colonel in the United States Army. It's spelled K-E-R-N-E-L. Without getting too technical, basically what a kernel is it's what an operating system is built on. But it's not the operating system itself. So we're using the Ubuntu, and this is how Ubuntu is spelled. We're using the Ubuntu operating system, but it's built on the Linux kernel. There are many, many distributions of Linux, and what a distribution is it's just you could substitute the word flavor. You know, Baskin-Robbins has 31 flavors. Well, there's more than 31 flavors of Linux, more than 31 distributions, or distros, as it's often shortened to, as you can see there. Distros of Linux. There's myriad, and I'll actually show you a tree of all of the different distributions of Linux. But Linux is a kernel, and the kernel is just what an operating system is built on. From, I know, Windows XP, but it may have even been one back from that. It may have even been Windows ME or Windows 2000. But I know from XP forward, the Windows kernel is, I think, Windows NT. And I can actually go into Firefox here and Google this to be sure that I'm correct, and that should take me to a Wikipedia page. Yes, good. Okay, so this is actually saying that it goes back as far as 1993. But at any rate, the Windows kernel is not the operating system either. Windows has its own kernel. I don't know. I don't want this to run too long. Anyway, Windows has its own kernel, which I thought at one point I'd heard called NT, and then Linux is a separate kernel. It's its own thing. Linux is based on Unix, but again, I'm not going to get too technical into any of that. All that I want you to understand is that there is a difference between a kernel and an operating system, and while Linux is often spoken about as though it is the operating system, it isn't. The commonality, and this is what's important to understand, the commonality did I leave a space there? The commonality between all Linux distributions is the kernel, not the fact that the operating systems are going to look the same and so forth. The different operating systems are not going to look the same. They have different desktop environments and so forth, but they are all built on that same kernel, and in that respect, there is some consistency in terms of all Linux distributions are going to be less, I'm talking orders of magnitude, tens, hundreds of thousands of times less likely to get a virus, for example, than Windows, because that's a function of the kernel, and it's also a function of the fact that it's open source free software too. And I'll get into that in a little while as far as what that means. So here's the tree, this sort of family tree of Linux, and this will help me explain what a distro is. Um, Again, all of these distributions or operating systems are based on the Linux kernel. And you can see this is a massive diagram. And each one of these is a distribution of Linux. Each one of these is a different operating system. Again, operating system and distribution are synonymous. The terminology that's going to be used in the Linux community is going to be distribution, or again, often shortened to distro, however. And this gives a family tree. Now this is where we get into forking, where you can see that each of these traces back to something. Well, each of these is a fork, is what it's called. So each of these is a fork of what? Well, if we go scrolling over to the left, these are each a fork of Debian. And so, for example, Ubuntu, which is what we're using right now, and you will see that right here. I'm going to move my mouse cursor around it. Ubuntu has many forks of itself, as you can see. And so some of these will have commonalities with Ubuntu in terms of, for example, all of these are going to allow you to do personal package archives or initialized to PPA. That's something that's unique to Ubuntu and all of its offshoot operating systems, all of its offshoot distributions or distros have that in common, that they will allow you to do PPAs. Some of the more common or more popular forks of Ubuntu would be Linux Mint, Kubuntu, which is just Ubuntu. Essentially, it's Ubuntu with the KDE desktop environment. I'll explain what desktop environments are in a while. Um, Xubuntu, which is here, is just Ubuntu with the XFCE desktop environment. So all of these are forks of this, and this Ubuntu that we're in right now is a fork of Debian. The commonality between all of the forks of Debian is that they use, as opposed to say Arch, which find Arch. Where is Arch? Not Slackware. Not Red Hat. Where is Arch? There's Debian. You know something? There we go. There's Arch. There's good old Arch. Now, I have on another computer running, if they have it, you know, they don't actually have it in this diagram, but I have a fork of Arch on another computer called Antergos. And so Arch has a different way of installing software than Debian does. With Arch, you have what's called Pacman or Yaourt, whereas in Debian and all of the forks that it has, of which Ubuntu is one, the way that they do uh, package archives and so on is actually aptitude or apt. And so we'll go into our terminal here, and I'll explain that you will need to know some terminal commands, and I'll explain what they are, but this is one that you will need to know. So this apt here, apt get, apt is how Debian and everything that it has given birth to, all of the distributions that it has given birth to that are forks of it, use aptitude or apt. and that's how you would enter that command. Whereas in Arch, it would be sudo pacman -s or -r if you were wanting to remove, etc., and then you would enter in the package name after that. So it's just a difference in terms of how that's structured and how that works. So those are the commonalities between them that you can see that there's. I mean, look at there's hundreds. There's hundreds of Linux distributions. Many of them are forks of some core distributions like Debian, Red Hat. You know, Fedora is a really popular one. Well, it's a fork of. If we can come down here, it's a fork of Red Hat. Red Hat used to be extremely popular. Debian is been extremely popular, and those are the ones that go back almost to the beginning of Linux. As you can see in the timeline here, if you scroll up, Debian goes all the way back to 1993, and that's when Linux started. So some of these others, like Ubuntu, for example, they're new operating systems, and some other popular forks come from other popular forks of those core distributions that were there at the beginning. So you had Debian, then Ubuntu forked from Debian. Well, Chromium OS, which I believe is what they use on Google Chrome's Chromebook, if I'm not mistaken, is obviously extremely popular because it's being used by the Google Chrome books. It's now also extremely popular, but it traces its roots back to Ubuntu. So there's commonalities in terms of how you do the package structure and so on, but what I'm wanting you to understand is that there's just myriad Linux distributions, myriad desktop environments used in those distributions, but the commonality between all of them is the kernel, which is the Linux kernel. Now, what are some, and I have my lesson plan here about things I want to be sure I touch on. So we've explained what Linux is. It's a kernel. It's not an operating system. There's operating systems that are built on the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel is different from the kernel used by Windows operating systems. So there are advantages and disadvantages to the Linux kernel and the operating systems or distros built on the Linux kernel. I'll start with the disadvantages, because I don't want anybody to feel like I'm trying to sell them on something. I don't want anybody to get into anything that they're not, if I were to lead with the advantages, I wouldn't want somebody to immediately hear the advantages and, ooh, less viruses, and run out and get a Linux distribution and put it on their computer and then find out that it's so different from Windows that they don't like it and they don't know how to use it. Okay, so we'll start with some of the disadvantages. The disadvantage to Linux is that a lot of the software that you're wanting to use in Windows, it's not going to run or not run the same way in Linux. For example, I can't use Internet Explorer in Linux. And again, you're hearing me do what most people that you have used Linux for years do, and I'm speaking of Linux as though it's the operating system. But you know better because of what I've just spent several minutes explaining. So when you hear me do that, just understand that while I'm talking about Linux like it's an operating system, I'm doing that because I'm covering the entire universe of Linux and all of its operating systems. So just understand that that's not me mixing terms. It's just for simplicity's sake that I do that. So in Linux, I can't use Internet Explorer. That's proprietary software. It's Microsoft's baby. It's not going to run in Linux. We don't have the licensing in Linux for this because it's proprietary software versus free software, and it won't run. There are ways to get around some of the compatibility flaws between the .exe binary packages of software that Windows understands and the way that software is handled in the Linux kernel. For example, wine, and I'm going to leave this open so that I can type things. Wine, spelled exactly, and that's what that is that's Windows, which is where you get the that's the Windows emulator. Windows, which is where you get WIN. Windows E comes from emulator. It tries to give you a way of running Windows programs in Linux. For some programs, we'll use video games as an example. For some programs, it works incredibly well, and you would not know the difference between the way that that video game functions in Windows versus the way that that video game functions in Linux running on Wine. Internet Explorer is like that. You can try to run Internet Explorer. It's kind of packaged with Wine, in fact, in Wine, but it's not the same as when you try to use it in Windows. So Microsoft Office, for example, you're not going to be running that in Linux. You're not going to be probably running Internet Explorer, even though Wine can try to get that for you. You're probably not going to be using Internet Explorer. Some of your video games that are made for Windows, some of them may work excellent in Linux using Wine. Others may not work at all. So there are issues with software compatibility. There are issues with hardware compatibility. Drivers, oftentimes for vast forms, graphics for graphics cards, for CD drives, joysticks, etc., etc. Vast forms of hardware go without Linux drivers made by the company that makes the hardware. I'll give you an example right now. The computer that I'm running this Linux distribution on that you're seeing has attached to it an external wireless card that's made by Netgear. It's an excellent card. It has the dual band. It will go on the 2.4 gigahertz as well as the 5 gigahertz band, and on the 5 gigahertz band I can get incredible speed on the wireless. The problem is there's no firmware, there's no driver for it that's compatible with Linux. So what I have to do is I have to take a crossover cable, a LAN cable basically, and attach it to another computer and use that computer's wireless card to get internet on this computer. And then, because I want I want those high speeds that the external wireless card can give me, when I boot on this computer back into Windows, I have to completely reverse the flow. And so the other computer, the computer I'm getting internet from now, gets internet from that wireless card. That wireless card only has a Windows driver. It doesn't have a Linux driver. So there are hardware compatibility issues as well as software compatibility issues in Linux. That's one of the things that you have to take into consideration before you choose to use Linux is, will my hardware handle it? Now there's a good resource for finding that out, and that is WikiDevi. And for example, I can A6200 should find it. There we go. This is the card that I'm talking about, the external Wi-Fi USB adapter. And you can see it, a nice picture of it there taken from Amazon. And so you scroll down here and you can see the chipset. BCM, which is Broadcom, that's the manufacturer of the chip. It's a Netgear device, but it uses a Broadcom chip. I'm not going to get too technical on any of that. I don't want to lose people. So it's BCM is the chipset, which stands for Broadcom 43526. Well, there's no firmware, no driver for the BCM 43526 chipset for Linux. And you can see right there, probable Linux driver, none. Big fat zilch. So you can't use that. So what you have to do is you have to find out what the hardware is in your computer, and does it have Linux compatibility. Uh, there are, in many cases, including with the other wireless card in the other computer that I was telling you about, that I'm getting internet on this computer through right now, it's also a Broadcom chipset. But it uses a free software, non-proprietary driver and firmware set. Okay? So even though this is Broadcom and it doesn't have, you see this is, Broadcom. Even though this is Broadcom and it doesn't have a driver, many Broadcom devices, wireless devices, do have compatibility with Linux by using the BCM43 Linux drivers, and I can actually show that too what I'm talking about, so that no one's confused here. In Ubuntu, you'll go in here into your system settings, and I'll show you how to get to that and all as well. You go into your system settings, and you go to software and updates, and then this comes up, and you'll go to additional drivers, and you'll see it will take it a second to load, but which you'll see for in many cases, if you have a um, Broadcom chip in your wireless device, you'll see up here that a list that will say Broadcom, or give the name of the card, your wireless card, and then you'll see BCM43XX so on driver. So there are non-proprietary drivers for a lot of the Broadcom devices. So, and again, this finds this automatically. You can see that NVIDIA, so NVIDIA is another good example of hardware compatibility issues. NVIDIA does release proprietary drivers, whereas Broadcom doesn't. The free software community has to kind of um, deconstruct the proprietary driver and make a free software driver on their own. Well, NVIDIA does release proprietary drivers, and you can see there's a whole list here that I can choose from of drivers, just different versions and different levels of updating for my NVIDIA card, which is a GeForce GT220 card. It's a fairly old card. But I also have this Xorg X, and that just relates to the X Windows server, that is responsible for actually displaying the graphical data through your monitor and through the GPU. That's an open source driver. So there's an open source driver. This will always be there, no matter what your graphics card is. This will always be available to you. And then if you're using an NVIDIA card, you'll see these pop up. So you have, in some cases, the hardware manufacturer does release a proprietary driver, and then in other cases, the free software community, the open source community, has to create one on their own that's available for everybody that's using the open source software, Linux basically, to use that. So that's an issue, is hardware and software compatibility. Understand that every program that you're using in Windows right now, a lot of that's not going to be compatible if you're using Linux. You're going to have to find a free software equivalent. For example, I had this open. This is LibreOffice. Okay? And you can see I can do word processing just fine with it. It has many of the same features and functions that Microsoft Office has. It's just not Microsoft Office. It doesn't cost me $400 damn either. It's free. Free as in gratis. Because there's also a difference too between when we're talking about FSF, which is the Free Software Foundation, when we're talking about the Free Software Movement and Free Software Open Source Movement. Because open source and free software aren't exactly the same thing, but there's crossover, there's parallel. Not all open source software is free software. When we're talking about free software in that context, we're not talking about free software as in free beer, free as in gratis. We're talking about free as in freedom. We're talking about, because there's only two ways that software goes. Okay, software can either control the user, or the user controls the software. Now, what does that mean? With proprietary software, because the user cannot, under the license terms and so on, legally change and alter the code, change and alter the software necessarily tends to lead to the software controlling the user. This is why we have some of the privacy issues and things that we have now with the NSA spying and so on. There's backdoors that these proprietary software companies can put in, and the user never knows about it, never sees it, because the user can't look at the code, not legally. Well, with free software, which is often open source software as well, I mean, again, not all open source software is free software, but all free software is open source. So with free software, the user controls the software. You have the ability to look at the code. You can edit the code. You can make it do what you want it to do. So, for example, this operating system right now, if I wanted to, I could get the code for that operating system, and I could edit things out if I had the skill to do that. I can put things in. I can make it do what I want it to do, and I can make it be what I want it to be. You can't do that with proprietary software. Examples of proprietary software would be the Windows operating system, or even the Mac OS, OS 10 or iOS. That's proprietary software. And proprietary software almost always ends up controlling the user rather than the user controlling software. And there's huge ethical implications for where proprietary software tends to lead versus where free software tends to lead. I'm not going to get too much into that because that's all cultural and sociological and political and so on, and we won't get into that. But so LibreOffice is an example of free in both terms of free software movement and free as in gratis. So this isn't going to cost you $400 like Microsoft Office would, but it has many of the same features and functions. You can choose the font and so on, bold, and a lot of the crossover too. I mean, you can tell that this is the centering. Well, that icon looks exactly the same as it would in Microsoft Office. There's huge crossover here in terms of how it looks and the features and functions. It's just this is a free software version. So in Linux, you're going to find that a lot of the software that you're using in Windows, you're going to have to find a free software equivalent. Now, some distributions of Linux make this easier than other distributions of Linux. In Ubuntu, it is. I'm going to get rid of that. I don't want anything in the terminal right now. We'll get to that later. In Linux, some distributions make finding a free software equivalent easier than in other distributions. Now, first off, I want you to understand too that in Ubuntu, LibreOffice is packaged out of the box. In other words, Ubuntu, when you download it and you install it on your computer, it's already there. So some free software alternatives are already going to be built into the operating system. I think all Linux distributions, with the exception of maybe Arch, and some of its offshoots, come with a lot of software bundled in. You don't have to compile it from source and things like you would have to have done in the old days of Linux 20 years ago, 15 years ago. A lot of these distributions now come with a lot of software packaged into it. And LibreOffice is an example of software that's packaged into it. And back to what I was starting to say before I digressed. Some distributions of Linux make it easier for you to find and install software in general and free software alternatives than other distributions. Ubuntu is one of those ones, and this is why I'm starting you out in Ubuntu. is because that's where I started myself, and the reason why I started there myself is because I did a lot of research when I was wanting to get into Linux, into which is easiest to use, which is the easiest Linux distribution to start off in, and Ubuntu is one of the real easy ones to start off in. As are forks of Ubuntu like Linux Mint and so on. One of the ways that Ubuntu makes it so easy for even someone who's just starting out using Linux to find those free software alternatives and software in general is they have this, which is the Ubuntu Software Center. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the Ubuntu Software Center to show you what I'm talking about. It really is just as simple as this. So it's going to launch, and then I have this program opened. You can see to the left here, categories. Okay? So you've just installed Linux. You don't have Microsoft Office anymore. Maybe you either don't like LibreOffice or you don't even know that LibreOffice is there. Okay, you're not aware that it's on your computer, whatever the case may be. So you're going to launch the Software Center, and you're going to go, geez, I need word processing. I really need word processing. So what are you going to do? You're going to click on Office, and then you have this entire list here of software to choose from. And you can see I have LibreOffice. I would not be at all surprised if I were to see pop up somewhere in here AbiWord. You look for it while I'm scrolling. Look along. There we go. And there's AbiWord, which is another free software alternative to Microsoft Office. But you can see there's a whole huge list here of things that you can choose from that are under the Office heading that you could use for word processing, for your mail. Instead of Microsoft Office Outlook. And you can see some of the other things that are bundled in with the LibreOffice package. I only have this icon here for the writer, but you also have LibreOffice Draw, which is kind of analogous to Microsoft Paint. You have LibreOffice Impress, which is kind of like Publisher was in Microsoft Office. Calc is like Microsoft Excel. So you see all these free software equivalents to the proprietary Windows programs that you're using now. But there is, again, the compatibility issue that if you really like Microsoft Office and you don't really want to deviate away from that for whatever reason, then you're probably not going to want to switch to Linux. If you don't have some sort of fetish, for lack of a better word, or you're not wedded to Microsoft Office in some way, and you have some flexibility there to where you don't have to have that, it's not a requirement, then you can move. Now, I already can see a question forming in many people's minds. It's a question I've been asked a lot. Well, if I'm not able to use Microsoft Office and I have to use free software, in this case LibreOffice, I have all of these documents that I've made that are on my computer, and they were created in Microsoft Office, and I don't want to not be able to open them and edit them and so on. You're asking a question about file type compatibility, and the file type compatibility is there. You don't have to worry about a document that you created in Microsoft Office that has a .doc or .docx, depending on how old your version of Microsoft Office was, not being compatible with your free software alternatives that you're going to have in Linux. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to click Save As. I'm not going to save this. You see that the default is going to be .odt, which is an ODF file. That's the default with LibreOffice. That's not compatible, to my knowledge, with Microsoft Word. However, you can see here .docx, and it says Microsoft Word 2007, 10, and 13 XML. That's .docx. That's going to be able to be opened in LibreOffice. I can also save this document. I can deviate from the default, which is an ODF text document. I can deviate from the default, and I can save this in a Microsoft Word compatible file type, and I can actually open that document in Microsoft Word. So you can see that the file type compatibility is there. The issue is the software compatibility in terms of, can I run Microsoft Office Word in Linux? The answer is no. Can I open a Microsoft Office Word file in Linux? Can I save a file in a file type that is compatible with someone opening it in Microsoft Word? The answer is yes. Okay, and I want to make that very clear. Okay, so that's the disadvantages. There's not very many disadvantages. In all honesty, you're probably for the most part not going to encounter very many issues. Should you choose to try Linux out, there are numerous advantages, however, and I think that the advantages, which are universal across Linux and all Linux distributions, far outweigh the relatively remote likelihood that you're going to encounter any kind of catastrophic problem that falls under the disadvantage column, like hardware compatibility and so on. You know, not being able, like what I was explaining about the card, my external wireless card. That's a relatively rare case of you not being able to find a workaround for an issue, not being able to find a free software non-proprietary driver for a device. Most of your devices in your computer are probably going to have a non-proprietary driver or a non-proprietary firmware for it. But these pluses far outweigh those remote likelihood of a minus. So the universal plus is, in addition to talking about viruses and malware, I also want to make a note to talk about things like defragging, etc. So one thing about Linux is, when you're using Linux-based operating systems, you are far less likely. Holy crap, 42 minutes already. You're far less likely to have problems with viruses. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of viruses and malware and so forth, and I'll even you get into millions. You get into the millions when you add in even things like relatively benign as compared to malware, spyware, adware, etc. versus what you have in Linux. Okay, so in Microsoft, you're using Windows. Uh, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of viruses, and at any given time there may be 40 or 50,000 that are currently active in the wild. Um, and sure, you can spend a ton of money to buy a third-party antivirus program that may protect you from some things, but won't protect you from everything. There's no such thing as a perfect antivirus program. Um, but in Linux, there's total. Again, in Windows, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands, and at any given time there may be tens of thousands that are currently active and current threats. In Linux, total, there's hundreds, and at any given time there may only be just a few that are currently active in the wild. Now, why is there such a difference in the level of risk of having a virus attack your computer in Windows versus the level of risk that exists when you're using Linux? Why is that? Well, one common misconception that people, including proponents of Linux, have for why Linux is so much more secure than Windows is that, well, it's because less people are using Linux. Well, that's simply not true. That's simply not true. Most of Asia at this point is using Linux. It has a huge Linux has a huge following in Asia. Linux, after the end of support for Microsoft XP in Europe, many people migrated to Linux because of that. Because they didn't want to have to upgrade the hardware, it would be too expensive, and Linux can run a light distribution of Linux can run on even older hardware just fine. So you're getting new software, you know, new programs that'll run on older hardware. And so they just migrated to Linux. One popular distribution is Lubuntu, which is the LXDE desktop environment version of Ubuntu. It's one of the forks of Ubuntu. That was a real popular one that was um, adopted by Europe. Many government agencies, both our government and others, use Ubuntu. Several of our branches of the armed forces use the Linux operating system to do what they need to do. So the idea that there's just no juicy, big fat juicy targets for people that want to create malware in the Linux community because there's just so few people using it it's just simply false. The real reason why Linux is less prone to viruses, malware, etc., is primarily there are a few reasons, but primarily the reason is that it's open source free software versus proprietary. The fact that there's more eyes on that code at all times means that if there's an exploit, some flaw that a person writing malware could use to exploit that weakness and gain control of your computer, spy on you, steal your data, whatever, um, it's going to be seen. Whereas it won't be seen with proprietary software because all of the users of that software aren't able to legally see that code. They don't know that that exploit is there, or that flaw is there. That's the primary reason why with Linux you're less likely to get a virus. But the other part of it is, going back to something I just touched on, this right here. Okay, I have to, before I do anything, so I'm just going to run sudo apt get update. Okay, sudo apt get update. Watch what happens. It asks for my password. Now, in Windows, you have user account control, but that's not a real strong defense against attack. Um, there's ways that malware can bypass that. It doesn't necessarily ask for your permission before it performs every single system function, for example. So it's better than not having anything at all. It's better than not having that account protection and so on layer at all. But it's not this. Okay, this is much better. So I have to enter in my user password, which you create when you install the operating system. By the way, you choose whatever password you want to use, and your username and so forth. It's easy to do. I can't show you in this because I can't run my screen capture during that, so I can't show that to you. But if you were to install Linux, if you were to download it and so on, it's easy. It's straightforward. You won't have any problem with it. And I have to enter my password in, and then it's going to run, and it's going to pull off of apt all of the packages that I have. It compares all of the packages that are on apt with the versions that I have, and then it'll tell me when I run sudo apt get upgrade as opposed to update. It just updates the list of packages. Now it's going to compare and it's going to show me, do I have any new packages that I can install, and updates to the software that I have on my computer, and it says no. It says no upgraded, 0 newly installed, 0 removed, and 0 not upgraded. And that's really straightforward. And that's an example also of terminal commands that you'll need to know in order to use Linux. Nothing too difficult. We'll get to that in a little while. This is going to be a very long video, and I may actually split this up and do two. But that's another reason for why Linux is more secure, is that the system won't do anything. It won't touch your software. It won't upgrade your software. It won't remove your software. You can't install anything. You can't do anything like that unless you explicitly tell the system that it's okay. You have to enter in a password. Now, I can perform the same function that I just did, and I'll use this as an example. The same function I just did in terminal, I don't need to use terminal for if I don't want to. Ubuntu has the software updater. Now, this does the same thing that you just saw all those lines of code doing. Well, it's not really code, but whatever. I click that, and now I'm going to launch the software updater. And the software updater is doing the same thing. If it were to find an update, which it shouldn't, because it didn't find it just now in terminal, but if it were to find an update, a dialog box would pop up prompting me to enter in my password. So no matter whether you're using a program like the software updater or you're doing it through here in terminal, the same thing applies. That system that you're using, this operating system right now, the system will not let you do diddly squat unless you explicitly tell it it's okay by entering in your password. Now, that's what sudo is. It's the, I believe it stands for super user domain, I think is what that's short for. It's saying that you are the big cheese. Okay, it's saying that you're elevating your user rights or user privileges, however you want to think of it, and however you want to process the concept. It's saying that you're root, basically. You're allowing yourself to become a root user. You're telling the system, hey, let me make a change to the core system. And that's what that sudo is. And anything entered after that, by the way, to explain this, sudo, and then anything entered after it, whether it's apt-get update, apt-get upgrade, sudo apt-get install, which is the command you would use to install a program, and so you would have the program name after it. Anytime there's a space in the program name, for example, Libra, I don't think LibreOffice actually spaces it, but like if I was wanting to install, that would install Mozilla Firefox, which is a browser. It's the browser that you saw me use and all that. That's Firefox Nightly. It's just a different. It's the test version, the bleeding edge, as opposed to the final version, the more stable version. So that's going to install a browser. So anytime you see a space, you have that little hyphen there. But that's how you would install a program. So anything that comes after sudo, it's going to prompt me for a password, and that's another part of what makes Linux operating systems more secure too, is the fact that all Linux operating systems, no matter what they may be a fork of, Ubuntu being a fork of Debian, or on my other computer, Antergos being a fork of Arch, that's another commonality. That's a commonality that exists at the kernel level, near as I can tell. So that's going to be universal across all Linux distributions. That's going to be the way that works. All Linux distributions are going to be that secure, that free of viruses. So that's a huge, huge plus. My personal view is that anything that you're doing, if you have access to Linux, if you can stand to use Linux, if it works on your hardware, then you should use Linux for anything you're doing online, because you're far less likely to get viruses and malware. A lot of it either simply isn't compatible because it's targeting the binary packaging, the .exe kind of way of doing things that Windows does. It's exploiting the registry, which there is, for all intents and purposes, isn't a registry in the sense that it works in Windows in Linux. So there's nothing for it to exploit. It doesn't work. It won't even install. It won't run. It won't do anything. It never enters your system in Linux. So anything that you're doing on the internet, I would say if you can use Linux, if you have access to it, do anything you need to do on the internet on Linux. And then what would you use Windows for? Well, I don't really know. To be honest, I mean, what would you use Windows for? I don't know. I really don't. If you have a video game that won't work in Linux that you really like to play, okay, fine, play that in Windows. But most of the things that most people are doing now are going to be internet-related things. You're watching YouTube videos, you're sending emails, you're browsing the web. Okay, use Linux. It's just safer. It's more secure. So that's a huge plus. And then the other thing too is that the software being free software, both in terms of free as in freedom, and free as in gratis or free beer or whatever you want to, however you want to think of it, zero cost in other words. Uh, it's a hell of a lot lighter in terms of the hit your wallet's going to take. Windows 10 is being offered to Windows 7 and 8 users free, as long as you upgrade in the first year after Windows 10's release. That's a relatively new thing. But for all intents and purposes, most of the programs that you're going to buy to use on a Windows system, you're going to be doing exactly that. You're going to be buying them. You're going to have to pay. I have a word processor right here that you're looking at right now that cost me nothing. It's an excellent, excellent word processing program. It cost me nothing. It has, near as I can tell, haven't used it a lot, every single one of the features that Microsoft Office has, but it didn't cost me a daggone thing. Versus if I were to run out and I were to buy Microsoft Office, I'm looking at paying $300, $400, or I can buy a Office 360, in which case I'm going to be paying a subscription fee, and I think it's a 1 year subscription each year. But that's still money, and it's money that, frankly, in my own personal case, I don't have. I don't have that money to spend. So there's free as in that, but then there's also the peace of mind too that if you do care about the ethics of software and the way that we do computing, and you care about things like privacy rights and so forth, then the free software movement is also where you want to be. Versus the proprietary software movement that has huge negative implications going forward in terms of economics, privacy rights, government security, and so on. So there's also that too, but that's more of a ideological plus versus the more pragmatic plus of something like, say, the fact that you're going to be less likely to get a virus. So those are the benefits. Who should use Linux and why? The reason why you would want to use Linux is, again, because you're less likely to get viruses. That's a good example. If you don't have the money to do upgrades to operating systems, if you don't have money to pay for software like email program, like if you don't have the money to buy a Microsoft Office, if you don't have the money to buy word processors, that kind of thing. Now, one thing I will say, because I wouldn't want anybody to switch to Linux, particularly if they're not going to be as happy or as comfortable using it as they would be with Windows. I wouldn't want anybody to switch because, oh well, it's cheaper to use a word processor. Well, you can get LibreOffice on Windows. There is a LibreOffice Windows version. So I will say that there are some of these same programs that you can use in Windows, but for all intents and purposes, when you're talking about any kind of program anywhere, it's just going to be more likely that you're going to find a free, in this case, free is in you don't pay anything, software alternative that you can use if you're running Linux versus a free software uh, program alternative to a proprietary program that costs you money if you're using Windows. It's just you're more likely to find free software in Linux. And a perfect example is I'm recording this video right now using the Simple Screen Recorder, which is an excellent and very powerful program. Um, I can't use this in Windows. And in Windows, when I want to record a video, like one of these tutorials, there really isn't any good free program that will let me do that. I've looked. I've scoured the internet hunting for one. There really isn't any of them that work. And the one that I was able to find has serious compatibility issues with Windows 10, which I'm testing. And so it keeps crashing. It won't even work. It doesn't want to recognize the microphone and play nice. Well, here again, I don't have that problem in Linux. There are programs that I can use to do the same thing in Windows, but to get a good one, I would have to pay for it. I would have to pay $30, $40, $50, $100 for that program to do this same function. That there's a free software program that does an amazing job in Linux. So that's a kind of example of what I'm talking about, that you're more likely to find excellent software for free that will do things in Linux than you are to find excellent software that will do things for free in Windows, because it's just an entirely different culture in proprietary software versus the open source free software movement. So um, we've done some terminology. Again, I've talked about, Linux is a kernel, not an operating system. An operating system is built on a kernel. Some of these other other terminologies we'll use in a different video. I'm going to, I think, split this up. I've explained sort of a lead-in to what Linux is and given a lecture about what Linux is and pluses versus minuses for using Linux and so on. The other thing I will say too is that in terms of who should use Linux, I would also say that anyone who doesn't have money to pay for um, security software should probably switch to Linux. You don't want your personal data being exploited. When you're buying something online or whatever, if there's a virus on your computer, it's entirely possible that it could exploit either a weakness in the operating system itself or in the browser. You have viruses and malware that will attack your system and destroy your files. Either because it forces you, because you can't get rid of that virus and it's attacking your computer and it's causing you problems and your system won't work right, to get an OEM disk if your computer didn't come with a Windows install disk. Blow away everything on your computer, because you can't back that stuff up, particularly if it's infected, and some malware won't let you back it up. Some malware won't even let your computer finish restarting, for God's sakes. You can't even get into your system. So you end up having to get an OEM disk or use the system install disk that came with your system. Blow everything away and start over from scratch. Well, you've just lost all your data. Congratulations. Um, there's malware out there that will hijack your computer. This is another thing. It's called ransomware. This is becoming a huge problem with Windows. And the ransomware attacks your system, and you have to pay some punk, often in Russia. A lot of these come from Russia. Money, and trust that scumbag to relinquish control of your system back to you after he gets the money. This is becoming a huge problem in Windows. You don't have this issue in Linux. So, obviously, if you can't afford to buy Norton or other good, high quality, reliable, and effective, most importantly, third party security software programs, then you should probably move to Linux. So if you're on a fixed income, if you're elderly and you're wanting to keep in touch with the grandkids on Skype and Facebook and things like that, but you can't afford the money to buy security software because you're on a fixed income, or you're a student and you barely have enough money to stock up on ramen cups for the week, you should probably switch to Linux. It'll be cheaper. You won't have to buy all this extra third-party software and all to do what you need to do and to keep your computer safe. So that's another thing that I wanted to touch on too about who should use Linux, is that there's, lower cost also means lower cost in terms of the third-party software that you need to get to protect your computer. You don't need to get any of that in Linux too. So I wanted to be sure that I made that point also. So that's the end of this. This is the end of this video. Just explaining pluses and minuses to Linux. Some of the obviously hardware issues and things that you could have but likely won't have, and some introduction to terminology about what a distro is and distributions and so on. So the following video that I'm going to make immediately after this and post it along with this one, these are both going to hit this evening, posting them both to YouTube this evening, we'll deal with actually how to use Ubuntu. So let me close this out and go and watch the following video if you are interested in Linux after hearing everything I've said about who should use it, who shouldn't use it. And again, you're forewarned now that there are issues with software compatibility. Some of the programs that you're used to using in Windows won't work in Linux and so on. So if even after hearing all of that, you're still interested in Linux, watch the video that follows this that will get you started in how to use Ubuntu. And I'll go through how to perform all of the core functions in the operating system and how to change settings and so on in the next video.